What if in a split second you had to choose between your own safety and the life of a child you've never met? She didn't hesitate. On the rain-slicked asphalt, between screeching tires and panicked screams, a young delivery girl did the unthinkable. And in that moment, without even knowing it, she changed the fate of two families forever. But who was she? And why did the most powerful man in the city fall to his knees at her feet? What happened next will leave you speechless. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share this heartwarming story that proves heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear delivery backpacks. So let's begin. 3 days before the accident, Claire was already awake by 5 a.m., carrying that all-too-familiar weight on her shoulders. The tiny room she shared with Sophie was freezing, and the heater, broken for months, was just one more thing on her growing list of impossible fixes. She could hear her younger sister's uneven breathing, that dry cough that had only gotten worse lately. Just one more day, she whispered to herself, like a morning mantra she'd grown used to repeating. The reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror showed dark circles under her eyes, and a face far too burdened for someone only 24. The hospital bill sat on the kitchen table, bold red numbers screaming silent urgency. Sophie needed tests, medication, appointments, words that translated into numbers Claire could barely pronounce. Every penny she made as a bike courier vanished before it even touched her hands, swallowed by the relentless cost of simply surviving. She looked at her sister sleeping, so small, so fragile at just 17, and felt that all-too-familiar mix of fierce love and helpless desperation. "I'll make it work," she whispered, brushing Sophie's warm forehead. "I swear I will." Being a delivery girl was her only way out, and her only shot at holding on. Riding the old bike she'd bought with her very first paycheck, Claire crossed the city carrying other people's dreams, hot meals, gifts, small luxuries that felt like distant mirages to her. Every push of the pedals was a battle against exhaustion, and against the hunger that sometimes stuck around for days. Her fingers, always cold, sometimes bleeding from cracked skin, clung to the handlebars like they were the only thing keeping her grounded. The streets of the city had become an emotional map, every corner tied to a memory, every uphill climb a quiet victory against the odds. But what really tore her up inside was the feeling she was racing against time. Sophie was getting worse. Claire could see it in her eyes, in the way she tried to hide the pain so Claire wouldn't worry. Nights felt longer, filled with whispered conversations about a future that kept slipping further away. "When I get better, I'll help you," Sophie would say, and Claire would fake a smile, both of them pretending they believed it. The truth was raw and unforgiving. Without money, without connections, without a miracle, they were stuck in a cycle that tightened around them a little more every day. Big cities are brutal when all you've got is willpower. Claire had knocked on countless doors, filled out endless job applications that went nowhere, dreamed of opportunities that seemed made for someone else. Her education ended too early, right after their parents died, and she had to raise Sophie alone. Now, at 24, she felt like she was aging too fast, trapped in a body worn down by the weight she never should have had to carry. Every morning was a fresh fight against the thought that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't strong enough to save the only family she had left. Their apartment was a shoebox on the 3rd floor of a building that looked like it had defied gravity and building codes for decades. The walls were paper thin. They knew way too much about their neighbors' lives. The smell of food they couldn't afford wafted in from other units, mixing with the constant scent of mold and cheap disinfectant. Claire would often look out their tiny, grimy window, watching life unfold down below. People rushing, moving fast, just like she used to before the world got heavy. She sometimes wondered if anyone down there ever looked up and thought about the two sisters who lived like shadows in apartment 3B. Week by week, she felt the walls closing in. Collectors kept calling, cold voices demanding money she didn't have. Their landlord had started making friendly visits, dropping hints that patience only stretched so far. Sophie tried to hide how much worse she felt, but Claire noticed the signs. Her pale skin, shortness of breath, those moments where she'd just stare off into space. It was like watching someone you love slowly disappear, and all you could do was hold their hand and lie through your teeth saying, "It's gonna be okay." And yet, There was something in Claire that just refused to break. A tiny flame still burned in her chest, fueled by every smile Sophie gave her. By every morning they managed to share a cup of coffee and laugh at something dumb on TV. She'd learned how to find strength in the smallest things. The warmth of the sun during deliveries, a customer's genuine thank you, a song playing from an open window. Those little fragments of beauty had become her hidden stash of hope, tiny treasures she saved for the hardest days. So on that Tuesday morning, when Claire set out for another shift, she had no idea that fate was about to test everything she believed about herself. The accident she witnessed was only the first domino in a chain of events that would change her life forever. As she pedaled through the familiar streets carrying her usual load of hopes and fears, Claire had no idea someone was already looking for her, someone ready to make an offer that would sound like the answer to her prayers, and the beginning of a mystery she couldn't yet understand. Claire Martinez was 24, but her eyes carried the bitter wisdom of someone who had lived a lifetime in each of them. Born in a neighborhood where dreams were a luxury few could afford, she learned early on that survival was an art you mastered with dirty hands and a broken heart. Her hands, small but incredibly strong, told the story of every job she'd ever done: calluses from hours on her bike, scars from minor accidents, nails always short and practical. When she smiled, something that didn't happen often, her whole face transformed, revealing the girl she used to be before life stole her innocence. But it was in her eyes where her real strength lived. Dark honey brown, they glowed with a kind of quiet determination that even poverty hadn't been able to dim. Claire's childhood ended when she was just 15, the day her parents died in a car crash. She still remembered the sound of rain hitting the hospital window, the sharp smell of antiseptic seeping into her bones, the feeling that the world had stopped making sense. Sophie, only 8 at the time, clung to her like she was the last solid thing in a collapsing universe, and in that moment Claire realized there was no space left for tears or self-pity. "I'll take care of you," she promised, and those words became the sacred vow that guided every choice she made from then on. She wasn't just Claire anymore. She was a mother, a sister, a protector, and a dreamer, all rolled into one. What almost no one knew was that Claire carried a secret, a quiet ache that haunted her every day. Before tragedy struck, she had been a brilliant student with dreams of going to medical school to help people like Sophie. Her grades were flawless. She'd even received a letter from a university offering her a scholarship. But when everything fell apart, she had to choose between chasing her dreams or raising her sister. That letter, now yellowed with time, was tucked inside a box under her bed, alongside her school awards and medals. Sometimes, on the loneliest nights, she'd pull them out and run her fingers over the paper like they were relics from a life she almost had, wondering if she'd made the right choice. Being a delivery girl wasn't just a job for Claire. It was her way of seeing a world that had always been kept from her. Every address was a glimpse into someone else's life, every delivery a small adventure that broke the monotony of her routine. She knew those streets like the back of her hand, where the dogs barked the loudest, where kids played after dark, which houses were kind and which ones she avoided. Her old second-hand bike, bought with her first paycheck, was more than transportation. It was her partner in crime, her quiet companion through the loneliest hours. Claire had learned to find poetry in the little things: the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, birds singing in the park, a customer's thankful smile. But behind all that strength and grit, Claire carried a fear that gnawed at her constantly. The fear of not being enough, of failing Sophie, of waking up one day to find that everything she had done hadn't been enough. Sometimes, when she was alone in the bathroom, she'd allow herself a few minutes of vulnerability, staring into the mirror and wondering how much longer she could keep up the illusion of being invincible. Her nightmares were always the same: Sophie slowly fading, slipping through her fingers like sand while she ran, breathless and helpless, unable to reach her. She'd wake up gasping, heart racing, needing to see Sophie's sleeping face just to calm down. The bond between Claire and Sophie was the emotional core that kept them both going. At 17, Sophie had grown into a sharp, intuitive young woman who understood far more than Claire wished she did. They had their own language, one built from glances, half smiles, and silent touches that spoke volumes. When Sophie wasn't doing well, Claire didn't need her to say a word. When Claire was overwhelmed, Sophie would crack a joke to make her smile. They were two halves of the same soul, bound by a love that rose above all the hardship. "You're my hero," Sophie would say, and Claire always replied, "We're a team." What made Claire truly special wasn't just her strength or resilience, but her strange ability to find light in the darkest corners. She had a secret ritual. Every night before bed, she listed 3 good things that happened that day. Sometimes they were tiny: a tip from a customer, a pretty sunset, Sophie laughing at something dumb on TV. Other times, even smaller: the fact that it hadn't rained, a song on the radio, the smell of coffee in the morning. This became her way of pushing back against the darkness, a quiet rebellion against despair. Claire wasn't conventionally beautiful, but there was something about her. Maybe it was the way she walked, with purpose, even when she had no idea where she was going. Or maybe it was how she treated people, with a genuine kindness that felt rare in today's world. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, catching the sunlight in just the right way. Her skin, freckled and always a little tired, still held a softness that contrasted with the toughness of her life. But it was her hands that told her story best. Hands that worked without rest, that cared, that held on, that never gave up. What Claire didn't know was that her life was about to cross paths with forces far bigger than she'd ever imagined. That split-second decision to save a stranger's child had triggered a chain reaction, one that would test not only her bravery, but her ability to tell the difference between a miracle and a trap. Someone powerful was about to step into her world, bringing opportunities she'd never even dreamed of, and secrets that could destroy everything she'd fought for. The question hanging in the air was simple, but terrifying. Was Claire ready to learn that some miracles come at a price she might not be willing to pay? Life has a cruel way of stacking up small tragedies until they form a mountain you just can't climb. On the Monday after the accident, Claire came home to find an eviction notice taped to the door. 48 hours to pay the overdue rent, or get out. Her hands shook as she held the yellow paper, the world spinning around her. Sophie was on the couch pretending to watch TV, but Claire could tell by her sister's tense shoulders that she'd already seen it. "We'll figure it out," Claire whispered, more to herself than to Sophie. But for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. Things weren't any better at work. Her boss at the delivery company, a bitter man who seemed to feed on other people's desperation, had cut back her orders, claiming she was too slow. The truth? He favored the male couriers, especially the ones willing to take shady delivery jobs that Claire always turned down. "You think you're better than the rest of them?" he snapped when she politely questioned him. Every word felt like a punch, not just because it was unfair, but because Claire couldn't afford to fight back. She needed that job, no matter how awful it was. The bills piled up on the kitchen table like soldiers lining up for war. Besides the rent, there was the electric bill with a shut-off warning, the pharmacy demanding payment for Sophie's medicine bought on credit, and letters from the hospital getting more threatening by the week. Claire spent hours doing impossible math, moving numbers around like chess pieces, hoping for some magic combination to make things add up. Her fingers were stained with ink from all the scribbles and calculations, and she didn't even notice she was crying until a teardrop smudged the page. Her bike, her loyal partner in all of this, was starting to give out. The chain slipped constantly, the brakes squealed ominously, and the back tire was way too bald to be safe in the rain. Every morning, she looked at it with a strange mix of love and panic, knowing she couldn't afford even the simplest repairs. One morning, during a time-sensitive delivery, the chain snapped completely. She ended up walking the bike home for 2 hours, blisters on her feet, tears in her eyes, and the sinking feeling she'd just lost tomorrow's paycheck. Sophie was clearly getting worse, no matter how hard she tried to hide it. The nighttime coughing fits were more frequent, her face was even paler, and some mornings she couldn't even get out of bed. The clinic doctor didn't sugarcoat it. Sophie needed tests the public system wouldn't provide anytime soon. "We can wait in line," he'd said, but his tone made it clear that waiting might mean waiting too long. Claire held Sophie's icy hand the whole appointment, feeling like she was watching her sister slowly slip away, one grain of sand at a time. Neighbors who used to just nod in the hallway were now eyeing them with a mix of pity and annoyance. The older lady next door made loud comments about people who can't pay their bills, while the young couple upstairs complained constantly about Sophie's coughing. Claire felt the weight of those judgmental stares every time she climbed the stairs, carrying not just her own burdens but the growing sense that they'd become a problem everyone wanted to avoid. It was like poverty was contagious, and people were afraid to catch it. Hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing at her stomach as she worked. Claire had come up with elaborate ways to hide from Sophie that she often went entire days eating nothing but bread and butter. She'd lie and say she'd already eaten, skip dinner, always making sure Sophie had 2 decent meals a day. But her body was starting to show the cracks. Her hands shook more, her focus slipped, and there were days she nearly fainted during deliveries. The bathroom mirror showed a version of herself that looked thinner and paler every day. But the worst part wasn't the pain or hunger, it was the isolation. Claire had lost touch with the few friends she once had. They went on to college, got real jobs, lived lives that felt like they were happening on another planet. She saw their photos online, smiling in nice restaurants, traveling, living the youth she'd never had. It wasn't exactly jealousy, just a deep, aching sadness for a life she'd never known. Sometimes, passing groups of laughing 20-somethings, Claire felt like a ghost, watching the world go on without her. But maybe the biggest enemy of all was the voice inside her head, the one that whispered its cruel doubts in the quiet hours of the night. You're not going to make it. Sophie's going to die because of you. You're not strong enough, smart enough, good enough. Claire fought back against that voice every day, but it was getting louder, harder to drown out. Some nights she'd lock herself in the bathroom and bite her hand to keep from screaming, just so Sophie wouldn't hear her falling apart. And still, every morning she got up, put on her armor of courage, and stepped out to fight a battle that felt impossible to win. What she didn't know was that someone had seen her silent fight, and an offer was on its way, one that would change everything, for better or worse. The knock on the door came on a rainy Thursday just as Claire was crouched on the kitchen floor trying to fix her bike with the few tools she had. The man standing on the other side wore a spotless suit that clashed dramatically with the decaying hallway of the building. "Claire Martinez?" he asked, his voice deep and polite. She nodded cautiously, her hands still stained with grease, wondering how someone so well-dressed had ended up at her door. "My name is Marcus. I work for Mr. Daniel Carter. He'd like to speak with you." The name meant nothing to Claire, but there was something about the man's posture that told her life was about to take a completely unexpected turn. 2 hours later, Claire stood in the entrance hall of the most luxurious building she'd ever seen. The marble beneath her feet reflected not just her image, but her deep sense of not belonging. Her clothes, clean but visibly worn, screamed her reality to anyone who looked her way. The elevator ascended silently to the top floor, and Claire felt her stomach drop. Not from the height, but from the overwhelming sense that she was stepping into a world that wasn't hers. Marcus watched her anxiety with an unreadable expression, and she couldn't help but wonder if he had started in a place like hers, or if he'd always belonged to this world of wealth and power. Daniel Carter stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in his office, looking out over the city like a king surveying his kingdom. When he turned to greet her, Claire was struck by the intensity of his blue eyes, sharp intelligence mixed with a sadness he tried to hide behind a polished demeanor. "Ms. Martinez," he said, extending a hand. "I couldn't find the right words to thank you for what you did for Mia." That's when it clicked. The child she had saved was his daughter. The realization hit her like a wave, as if the pieces of her life had suddenly rearranged themselves into something she couldn't yet comprehend. The offer was wrapped in carefully chosen words, but the core was clear and life-changing. Daniel was offering her a job as his personal assistant with a salary 3 times what she made in a month delivering food. He spoke of responsibilities, flexible hours so she could take care of Sophie, and a health plan that would cover all of her sister's treatments. His words floated in the air like impossible promises, and Claire subtly pinched herself to make sure she wasn't dreaming. "I don't get it," she whispered. "Why me? I'm sure there are people way more qualified." Daniel smiled for the first time, and for a second, he looked almost vulnerable. Skills can be taught. Character can't. But Claire had learned the hard way that when something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Throughout the conversation, a small voice in her head whispered warnings. Powerful men didn't do charity for nothing. She couldn't figure out what Daniel's real motive was. Her palms were sweating as she tried to absorb everything, caught between the rush of hope for Sophie and the gut-level fear that she was stepping into something way bigger and way riskier than she could handle. "I need to think about it," she finally said. Daniel nodded as if he'd been expecting that all along. "Of course. But don't take too long. Some opportunities have expiration dates." The cab ride back home was a blur of clashing thoughts. Claire stared out the window at her familiar city with unfamiliar eyes. The grimy streets, the crumbling buildings, the people struggling to survive. It all felt more real, yet more distant than ever. She thought of Sophie, probably at home wondering where she was, and the stack of bills waiting on the kitchen table. The business card in her pocket burned against her thigh like some magical talisman that could solve everything. So why did it feel like she was about to sign a deal with the devil? When she got home, Sophie was asleep on the couch, wrapped in the worn blanket they shared. Claire stood there for a long time, memorizing every detail of her sister's pale face, the uneven breathing, the dark circles that grew deeper each day. There was her answer. No matter what Daniel's hidden motives were, she couldn't afford to walk away from something that might save Sophie's life. She sat at the edge of the table, grabbed a pen, and started making a list of pros and cons, but gave up halfway through. Some risks are worth taking, especially when the alternative is watching someone you love fade away. She called Daniel at 6 the next morning, finally admitting to herself that she hadn't slept a single minute. "I accept," she said simply when he answered. There was a pause on the other end, followed by what sounded like a quiet sigh of relief. "Good. Marcus will pick you up at 9. We'll start with a trial period." As she hung up, Claire felt like she'd just signed her own fate in invisible ink. Sophie stirred at that moment as if sensing the shift in the air, and asked in a hoarse voice, "What's going on, Claire? You look different." Claire smiled and kissed her forehead. "I think our luck is finally turning around." But as she got ready for her first day in this strange, intimidating new world, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to find out that some miracles come with instructions written in very fine print. The last thing she saw before leaving the apartment was Sophie waving from the window. She tucked that image into her heart like a charm against whatever might go wrong. What waited for her in Daniel Carter's office was more than just a job. It was the start of a journey that would test not just her adaptability, but her ability to tell salvation from manipulation. And deep down, Claire knew she'd crossed a line she might never be able to come back from. Ryan showed up in her life like a beam of sunlight breaking through the storm clouds of uncertainty that had hovered over her first month at the company. He was a financial analyst a few years older than Claire, with a warm smile that stood out in a building full of cold, calculating faces. "You look lost," he said on her third day, finding her standing by the elevator, clearly confused by the numbered buttons. His voice had a kindness she hadn't heard in ages. When he offered to walk her to the cafeteria, something inside her softened, for the first time since she stepped into that building. There was something honest about Ryan, something that didn't ask for anything in return. And that kind of kindness, it was rarer than gold in that corporate jungle. Lunch with Ryan became the highlight of Claire's days. He didn't pry about her past. He didn't judge her worn-out clothes or her lack of corporate know-how. Instead, he cracked jokes about coworkers, explained how the company worked, and sometimes they just sat in quiet comfort, watching the city bustle through the massive cafeteria windows. "You see things differently," he said one afternoon, stirring his coffee. "It's refreshing to work somewhere everyone seems born in a suit." Claire laughed, and realized it had been a long, long time since she'd laughed like that. Genuinely, without pretending to be okay. Daniel, on the other hand, remained a mystery wrapped in tailored suits. During those first few weeks, he kept a professional distance, polite, precise, but with no trace of warmth. Claire sat just outside his office, managing his schedule, taking calls, coordinating meetings, but always feeling like an outsider to a world she couldn't quite understand. He arrived early, stayed late, and carried the weight of something unspoken on his shoulders. Sometimes she'd catch him standing by the window, staring into nothing, his posture filled with quiet sadness. Who was Daniel Carter when he wasn't playing the role of ruthless CEO? The shift in their relationship began on a rainy Friday afternoon, when Mia showed up after school. Claire was sorting documents when she heard a giggle she recognized immediately. She turned to see the little girl she'd saved running toward her. "Claire! Claire, Daddy, it's Claire!" Mia shouted, launching herself into Claire's surprised, emotional arms. Daniel's face changed instantly. The cold professionalism melted away, replaced by an expression of pure tenderness Claire had never seen before. "She hasn't stopped talking about you since that day," he said. And for the first time, Claire saw the man behind the executive mask, a father who loved his daughter more than anything. Mia became the bridge Claire never knew she needed to truly see Daniel. The girl was lively, curious, full of questions. When she had to wait for her dad at the office, she always drifted toward Claire's desk, drawing pictures, talking about school, asking about Sophie. "You have a sick sister? I can draw her something to help her feel better," she offered one day. Claire's heart tightened at the sweetness. It was impossible not to fall for this little spark of a girl. And through her, Claire began to see Daniel in a whole new light. Everything changed for good the night Claire stayed late finishing up reports. Daniel stepped out of his office and found her still typing under the soft glow of her desk lamp. "You don't have to stay this late," he said. But instead of leaving, he pulled up a chair and sat beside her. They started talking about work, but the conversation slowly drifted into something much more personal. Daniel opened up about Mia, about how hard it was being a single father in a world that demanded constant sacrifice. His voice softened, became human, and Claire realized he was trusting her with something deeply painful. "My wife died when Mia was 2, he said, staring at his hands. "Cancer. It was quick." The grief in his voice was unmistakable, and Claire felt a wave of empathy she hadn't expected. She knew that pain, the feeling of being shattered and having to stay strong anyway. "I know what that's like," she whispered, and told him about her parents, about Sophie. They sat in silence, 2 survivors sharing invisible scars, and something shifted between them, something far beyond a job title. But it was Ryan who noticed the change first. "Careful," he warned one afternoon as they walked to the parking lot. "Daniel Carter has a reputation for getting emotionally involved with his employees. It never ends well." There was something in Ryan's voice that made Claire stop. Jealousy? Genuine concern? Something darker? "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Ryan hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Because I care about you, Claire. More than I probably should." The words hung in the air like an unspoken question. And Claire's world got a whole lot messier. She was starting to feel torn between 2 men, completely different, and completely outside her depth. The tension came to a breaking point the night Claire got a call from the hospital. Sophie had collapsed at school. She was in the ER. Claire ran out of the office, but Daniel caught up to her in the parking lot. "I'm coming with you," he said, and it wasn't a request. On the way, he held her hand as she cried, and in that moment, all the lines between boss and employee disappeared. "She's going to be okay," he whispered. And Claire believed him, because she had to. At the hospital, they found Sophie pale but awake on a stretcher. Daniel didn't hesitate to cover every test the doctors suggested. "No arguments," he said when Claire tried to protest. "Family is everything." But as they waited for the results, Claire couldn't stop thinking about Ryan's warning. And the question haunted her. What was really behind Daniel's generosity? The hospital clock read nearly 3 a.m. when the doctor entered the waiting room with a grim look on his face. Claire jumped to her feet, heart pounding out of rhythm. "She needs emergency surgery. It's serious and expensive," he said, choosing his words carefully. Claire didn't even hear the last part. It felt like the floor had vanished beneath her. All she could see was Sophie's pale, fragile face behind the glass door. There was no more time. It was now or never. She stumbled out of the hospital, vision blurry, lungs burning. She needed air. She needed to think. In the empty parking lot, Daniel caught up with her in silence. I'll pay for the surgery, he said flatly. Claire stared at him, feeling her soul split into pieces. Why? What do you want in return? She asked, her voice raw. He pulled an envelope from his pocket. I need you to sign this. It's a confidentiality agreement and an exclusivity clause. Claire froze. Exclusivity in what? She asked. He looked away. You'll find out soon. But I promise, Sophie will live. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. The clauses read like they were written in another language. Cold, calculated, clinical. Claire knew that contract hid something much bigger. But desperation has a way of silencing even the most cautious minds. She signed it, the pen feeling heavier than a sentence. The silence between her and Daniel thickened like smoke. As she handed the paper back, she said, If my sister doesn't make it, I swear I'll drag you down with me. Daniel just nodded, like a man who knew exactly what he was buying. In the days that followed, the surgery was scheduled, and Claire buried herself in work like she was trying to erase what she'd done. But something had shifted. The looks in the office, the whispers when she walked by, strange meeting invites that weren't on the schedule. The feeling of being watched grew like a shadow she couldn't shake. Ryan, once calm and warm, now seemed distant, avoiding her gaze. What did you do, Claire? He asked one afternoon. What exactly did you sign? She didn't answer because truthfully she didn't know. One night Claire found a locked folder in the office cabinet, with her name on it. The padlock gave way to a paperclip and firm hand. Inside, copies of the contract, handwritten notes by Daniel, and photos. Photos of her with Sophie, with Ryan, with Mia, all recent, all taken without her knowing. A chill raced down her spine. This wasn't a job contract. It was surveillance. It was control. What does he want from me? She whispered, throat dry. But before she could even form an answer, the door creaked open. It was Daniel, and he saw the folder in her hands. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. Daniel shut the door slowly, the kindness gone from his eyes. You weren't supposed to see that yet. Claire let the folder drop to the floor. Yet? What is this? A test? A game? He stepped closer. It's protection. You have no idea the kind of people I deal with, Claire. I did this to keep you safe, and Sophie too. But the trust they'd built, so carefully and slowly, shattered like glass. I'm not your property, she said, her voice cold, and my life's not for sale. She left that night torn between fear and fury. But what haunted her most was the doubt. Had she sold her soul to the devil to save her sister's life? On the packed bus back to the hospital, Claire stared at the tired faces around her. Every person had their own pain, their own invisible contracts with desperation. But maybe none were as close to losing everything as she was. And somewhere deep down, even if she didn't know it yet, the truth was about to surface. And it would come with a betrayal she never saw coming. Because sometimes the real enemy isn't the one you fear, it's the one you trust. Claire didn't sleep that night. Sitting in a hard plastic chair in the hospital hallway, her hoodie balled up under her head, she stared at the harsh ceiling lights, trying to stitch together a plan that made sense. Sophie still lay in her hospital bed, sedated, breathing in sync with the steady beep of machines. Each sound a cruel reminder of how quickly time was slipping through her fingers. I put you in this, Claire whispered. But something new stirred inside her. Not guilt, but resistance. The next morning, instead of heading to the company, Claire took a detour. She went to an old address, a rundown building that used to be a community center in the neighborhood where she grew up. There she found Lucio, a former teacher now running free workshops for teens. He'd always been sharp and well-connected. You need to find out what's really behind all this, he said after she told him everything. But you've got to play the game better than they do. And for the first time, Claire realized her strength wasn't just in surviving, it was in outsmarting. For the next few days, Claire lived a double life. By day, she was flawless, on time, professional, untouchable. By night, with Lucio's help and a few trusted contacts, she dug through contracts, employee records, and public files. What she uncovered was staggering. Shady charity deals, money laundering schemes masked as donations, and most shocking of all, links between Daniel Carter and local politicians under investigation. It was way bigger than she imagined. And now, she was dead center in the web. Ryan, though distant, began to notice a sharper edge in Claire's eyes. "What are you doing?" he asked in a quiet hallway. "Looking for answers," she said. "Be careful. Answers usually come with more questions. And danger." There was something in his tone that told her. He knew more than he let on. And that only pushed her further. Claire couldn't blindly trust anyone anymore. She needed evidence, and fast. Sophie was recovering, but each hospital bill was a ticking time bomb. And the money for her surgery was now being used as leverage to keep Claire silent. On a cold night, Claire snuck into one of the company's archive rooms using a borrowed badge. She knew the risks. But she also knew she wouldn't sleep again until she found out what was rotting beneath the surface of Daniel's generosity. Digging through physical files, she found a box labeled Humanitarian Funds, Confidential. Inside were receipts for massive wire transfers to fake institutions, digitally signed by Ryan. Her stomach dropped. "No, this can't be," she whispered, her hands shaking. Confused and shaken, she brought the documents to Lucio. He examined them carefully. "This is a setup. Sloppy, too. Someone's trying to pin it all on Ryan." And suddenly the pieces clicked into place. Daniel was using Ryan's name to cover his tracks. And if Claire didn't act fast, the whole thing would come crashing down. Right on the only man who had ever truly tried to protect her. Fury boiled in Claire, not just for what they were doing to Ryan, but for the dirty game that had swallowed her from the start. The next day, Claire walked into the company building with a plan. She carried copies of the falsified documents and a hidden recorder. Her goal? Confront Daniel, but also to see just how far he'd go to keep his empire intact. As she walked past reception, her heart beat so hard it rattled her chest. Each step toward his office was a mix of fear and resolve. Sophie was alive. Now it was time to fight for the truth. She walked into his office unannounced. Daniel was alone, as always, surrounded by glass walls and silence. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. Daniel looked up, and something in his eyes shifted. He knew. The game had changed. Claire dropped the folder on his desk and hit him with a single question. "Why Ryan?" He didn't answer right away. "You wouldn't understand, Claire. There are things that have to be done to keep the balance." But Claire now understood more than he realized. What Daniel didn't know was that everything was being recorded, and that Claire, the invisible girl who once rode through city streets with nothing but hope in her tattered pockets, had become a real threat. The game had changed, and she was finally playing by her own rules. 3 days after confronting Daniel, Claire handed over the documents and the audio recording to an investigative journalist Lucio had recommended. It was her boldest move yet. She didn't trust the system, but the truth had to come out. For Sophie, for Ryan, and for herself. The journalist, a man with guarded eyes and a measured voice, read through every page in silence. "If what you're saying is true, this could bring down more than just a company. It could unravel entire alliances." Claire nodded. "That's why it needs to be told." The next day, Ryan disappeared. Claire called him, texted, searched everywhere. No one knew anything. Or they pretended not to. It was Daniel who delivered the news, with a calm that bordered on mockery. He resigned, took a trip, said he needed rest. Claire didn't buy it. Not for a second. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and she was done being kept in the dark. That night, she searched Ryan's office under the excuse of retrieving old documents. Between files, she found a folded letter hidden behind a picture frame. It was handwritten. From Ryan. "Claire, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Or rather, I've been taken off the board. I tried to protect you the best I could, but I underestimated the enemy. Daniel's not just a CEO, he's a strategist, and you entered the game much earlier than you realized. That contract you signed, there are clauses even he hasn't revealed. I uncovered part of it, and I paid the price. Don't trust anyone now, Not even me. The letter shook in her hands. So did her heart. She rushed home, where Sophie was finally sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. Claire sat at the edge of the bed and watched her breathe. This was why it all started. And this was why it had to continue. The fear she felt now was different, not fear of poverty or pain or loss, but fear of losing control of a story that had taken on a life of its own, of becoming just another disposable piece in a much larger game. But something had changed in Claire. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting back. The next morning, the article went live. The scandal exploded across every media outlet. Headlines screamed about fraud, fake contracts, shell companies, and internal manipulation. Daniel Carter was summoned to testify. Reporters swarmed the company building. Chaos was in the air. Claire arrived early at the office. Everything was silent. Daniel's door was locked, but there was an envelope on her desk. No name, no sender. Inside, a single note. We need to talk. Alone. Tonight. Claire went. Alone. She met Daniel at his home, not the office. He looked different, worn down. More human. You destroyed everything, he said, not with anger, just quiet resignation. Claire said nothing. Ryan was my best friend. I knew he was helping you. I knew you'd eventually find out. And still, I let it happen. He rubbed his hands over his face, tired. I lost my wife because of this world. Mia. She's all I have left. I was trying to protect both of you. But now, everything's out of control. Claire took a deep breath. You can still fix it. Tell the truth. Daniel looked at her with hollow eyes. You still don't get it, Claire. I am the truth. I'm the foundation holding this all together, and you just pulled the thread that might bring down a lot more than this company. She didn't flinch. Then let it fall, because if you don't, someone a lot more dangerous will. And when that happens, no one, not you, not Mia, will be safe. Daniel stared at her like he was truly seeing her for the first time. You've changed. Claire smiled, but there was no joy in it. I had to. But nothing could prepare her for what came next. The following night, Claire was summoned to an emergency board meeting. The lights in the building were too bright. Security seemed doubled. New cameras were watching from angles she'd never noticed before. A nervous employee led her through empty corridors to a room she'd never been in. Inside, Daniel and 2 lawyers. You're being placed on administrative leave effective immediately, one of them announced. Allegations have been made. We need to investigate. It felt like the ground gave way beneath her. Claire stood tall. You really think this'll shut me up? Daniel stayed silent, his eyes red, hands clasped, staring at the floor. If I go down, you go down with me, she said. Eyes locked on him. One of the lawyers sighed. Mr. Carter, perhaps we should speak privately. Daniel raised a hand. No. She deserves to hear this. He rose slowly, every motion heavy with regret. I knew everything, Claire. From the beginning. The fraud, the surveillance, the use of your name. All of it. But I thought I could control you. Her throat tightened. And Ryan? What did you do to him? Daniel hesitated. He knew too much. I tried to keep him close, but he disappeared before I could stop him. Silence fell like a verdict. He's dead, isn't he? She asked, voice cracking. Daniel didn't answer, and the silence hurt more than a yes. Claire covered her mouth, trying to keep from sobbing. You killed the only man who tried to protect me, Daniel whispered, broken. It wasn't like that, but I was responsible. Claire turned to leave. You're finished, she said coldly. I'm going to the press, to the authorities. You might have money, Daniel, but you don't own me anymore. He stepped forward, tears in his eyes. I didn't want to lose you, too. She stopped, but didn't turn. You never had me. And walked out, legs trembling, spine straight. In the hallway, every step weighed 1,000 pounds. But she was doing this. For Sophie. For Ryan. For herself. It was time to end the silence. The next morning, Claire held a press conference outside the company building. The media was already there, circling like vultures. With a steady voice, she laid it all out. The job offer, the contract, the surveillance, the fraud, the emotional blackmail. She named names. She didn't blink. Daniel watched from the penthouse, Mia at his side. For the first time, his daughter looked at him with eyes he didn't recognize. "Is that the lady who saved me?" Mia asked. Daniel swallowed hard. "She's the lady who saved the truth." Hours later, federal agents stormed the building. Files seized. Computers confiscated. The Carter empire was officially collapsing. Claire watched from a distance, not with vengeance, but with justice. Sophie, now stable, squeezed her hand tight. "You did it, Claire." And Claire, with tears in her eyes, replied, "We did it." They hugged in the middle of the crowd, in the middle of the noise, as if that moment marked the end of a nightmare that had gone on for far too long. But one last piece of the puzzle remained. Later that afternoon, Claire received a letter, delivered by an anonymous courier. Inside was a handwritten note, from Ryan, dated just days before he vanished. "If I don't come back, don't look for me. I chose to disappear so the truth could survive. Take care of Sophie, take care of yourself, and remember, real love sometimes hides in silence." Claire dropped to her knees, clutching the letter to her chest. He wasn't dead. He had disappeared. For her. For justice. And no one could ever erase that. That night, with a world collapsing and rebuilding around her, Claire looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, Ryan." And for the first time, she felt truly free. The days that followed were all about rebuilding, not just the world around her, but the one inside her. Claire no longer walked into the hospital as a visitor, but as a volunteer. The pediatric wing, where Sophie now did respiratory therapy, had become her emotional safe haven. She read stories to hospitalized kids, organized donation drives, and sat with desperate mothers with the same empathy of someone who had been in their shoes. "You're good with them," a nurse said one day, smiling. Claire simply replied, "Because I know what pain feels like." Sophie was getting stronger every day. The light had returned to her eyes, the color to her cheeks, and with her health came a new dream. Nursing school. "I want to help the people who helped us," she said. Claire smiled, squeezing her hand. "You already have." Together they built a new routine. Simple dinners, afternoons in the park, old movies. For the first time, they weren't talking about overdue bills or what they'd have to sell next. They were talking about tomorrow. And that, in itself, was a miracle. Daniel Carter had been indicted, but was still awaiting trial on bail. The company had been handed over to a new board, and many employees were let go. Claire felt no anger, only relief. She knew that chapter was closed, even if it left scars. One day she received a message from Daniel. "I hope you're doing well. Mia asks about you. And I still think about everything we went through." Claire never replied. Some answers don't need to be written. Some stories, no matter how intense, have to end. With the settlement money, secured after the scandal broke, Claire opened a small community bookstore in her neighborhood, a cozy space filled with donated books, fresh coffee, and conversations about dreams and new beginnings. It was everything she'd ever wanted, a place where people could breathe hope. "What do you want people to find here the most?" a local reporter asked. Claire thought for a moment. "Refuge," she answered, "because everyone deserves a place where they don't have to pretend they're okay." But it wasn't all sunshine. Some nights, she still woke up crying, missing Ryan. Sometimes his absence felt like a presence. Other times she wondered where he was, or if he was even still alive. She kept his letter tucked inside her planner, folded and reread so many times the ink was fading. But the last line always made her smile. "True love sometimes hides in silence." And it was in that silence that Claire rebuilt herself. She began writing. Short essays about pain, healing, and survival. An editor, a regular at the bookstore, read her work and suggested turning it into a book. "You have a story that can heal others," he said. Claire hesitated, but said yes. If it helps even one person keep going, then it's worth it. Months later, the book was published, Invisible Scars. And to her surprise, it touched hundreds of readers. They didn't just see a protagonist in Claire, they saw inspiration. The simple life she was now building was everything she'd ever dreamed of. No luxury, but peace. No guarantees, but purpose. Claire still carried her wounds. They hadn't vanished. But they'd stopped being burdens. They'd become part of the story that shaped her. "You're so strong," people would say. And she'd always answer with quiet honesty, "I'm not strong. I just learned how to keep going." One spring afternoon, as she was closing the bookstore, Claire saw a little girl in a pink dress running down the sidewalk. Her mother followed close behind, laughing. Claire stood still, eyes misty. In that moment, she understood. Not every ending has to be spectacular to be beautiful. Sometimes just being able to breathe and smile, that's the greatest victory. But one last letter was still on its way, and with it, a truth that had been hidden far too long. It came in an unmarked beige envelope, slipped under the bookstore door on a rainy evening. Claire recognized the handwriting before she even opened it. Her hands shook. She sat on the floor, leaning against the philosophy shelf, and read it slowly, as if every word might change everything. "You won, Claire. I saw everything from my hiding place, from the place where I had to die in order to live. I never stopped protecting you. I just had to disappear, to give you freedom. Watching you from a distance was my penance, and my peace." The tears came without warning, quiet, burning. It was from Ryan. He was alive. He had disappeared by choice, just like he said in his first goodbye. "You taught me that courage isn't always facing the world head on. Sometimes it's knowing when to step back. And you faced everything, for both of us. I owe you my life, and I'll always love you, even if I can never stand beside you again." Claire pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. It wasn't the ending she expected, but it was the one she needed. That night, she walked to the old overlook on the edge of the city, a place where she used to go just to think. She brought only the letter, her silence, and her memories. There, she tucked the letter between two stones and whispered to the wind, "Go. Be happy, I'll try too." For the first time, she didn't feel pain. She felt gratitude. And it was freeing. The love that remained was quiet, mature, whole, even without a fairy tale ending. It was real. The following months passed gently. The bookstore thrived. Sophie started her nursing program. Neighbors who once looked at Claire with pity now looked with respect. "You changed everything around here," said one. But Claire knew. She hadn't just changed her neighborhood. She'd changed herself. The girl on the bicycle was now a woman who had stood up to giants, who fell, got back up, and chose to never live on her knees again. Her book, Invisible Scars, was adapted into a local theater play. A youth group rehearsed it passionately. Claire often watched the rehearsals quietly from the empty seats. It was surreal, watching her life portrayed on stage. Stranger still was realizing how much she had endured and survived. "You're the kind of heroine every story wishes it had," the actress playing her said. Claire just smiled. "And you're living proof that pain can become art." On Sophie's birthday, Claire threw a small picnic at the park. When Mia arrived with her nanny holding a crayon drawing that read, "For my hero Claire," Claire couldn't hold back the tears. Daniel wasn't there. Maybe out of respect, maybe regret, maybe love, still from afar. But Mia was there, and that was enough. "She talks about you every day," the nanny said. Claire knelt, picked up the girl, and whispered, "And I think about her every day." The scars were still there, invisible but real. At night, when she closed the bookstore, the quiet sometimes brought back too many memories. But now, Claire had armor, good memories, true victories, unbreakable bonds. She had won. And she had turned her story into something bigger than pain, into a bridge, into light, into inspiration. Have you ever helped someone when they needed it most, or received help at your lowest moment? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more emotional stories like this one. Because sometimes, healing begins with someone else's story. And maybe, today, that story was for you.